Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good? I see smiles. That's a good sign. That's a good sign. Well, good evening. My name is Allan Mueller. I am the Community Development Director for American Public Square, and it's a real privilege to have you all here tonight. I want to start by thanking our sponsor for this evening's event, UMKC, who's had a very important and big day, so we're delighted to be hosting this event this evening. I also want to thank American Public Square's presenting sponsors, which include the Abernathy Charitable Trust, the H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, the Hall Family Foundation, and the City of Kansas City, Missouri. Let's give UMKC and all of our presenting sponsors a round of applause. As many of you know, American Public Square is a member-supported organization. How many of you are members of American Public Square? Excellent. I love seeing those hands. And I see some hands not quite raised. And so I hope that you'll consider joining us. We bring together people from all walks of from every corner of our community to engage in civil fact-based dialogue. And so there's information in your playbill tonight about how to join. We also have members outside, who will be outside this evening after the program if you'd like to join this evening. Additionally, you can visit us at americanpublicsquare.org if you'd like to learn more about membership and about our programming. If you didn't actually register for tonight's event, that's okay. But I hope that you'll, while we're sitting here, maybe use your phones to register. If you visit americanpublicsquare.org and click on our events page, what that will allow us to do is to send you a survey from this evening's event so you can comment on the event itself. It will also enable us to tell you about other events as they come up throughout the year. Because of the generous support of the William T. Kumper Foundation, you may have noticed that you had access to a fact sheet on the back table and also in the reception table outside. The facts are prepared by research librarians to provide you a little bit of background about the topic. We do this at most of our events, and we're very delighted to bring you one of those tonight. So please take a look at that either now or after this evening's program. Additionally, in your playbill, you should have received a fact and question sheet. So on one side, you see it says fact check. On the other side, it says question. If there's something that you'd like to have a fact checked about this evening, please write it down and hold it up. A volunteer will come through and pick that up for you and take it over to our fact checker, Chris, so that she can take a look at that. Additionally, on the back side of that same slip of paper is a place to write any questions that you have. Our roving reporter is here somewhere. Eric Nelson, where are you? There you are. There you are. So if you have a question, please again hold that up, and Eric or another volunteer will come through and collect that from you. What Eric will do is ask the questions for this evening's event, or if you prefer, he can bring the microphone to you so you can ask your question directly. Additionally, I believe that there are some civility bells out there. Does anybody have a civility bell who wants to ring one for me? Oh, they're here. Yes. Thank you, Chris. I'll come through and maybe hand those to a few of you. If you find that the tone of tonight's conversation from our esteemed panel becomes less than civil, I hope that one of you will ring the bell to remind our panelists to be civil. They will have an opportunity to stop their conversation and walk back any conversation that was maybe ill-intended. All right. Let's see. What am I missing? I introduced you to Chris LeBeau, sort of. Chris will be our fact checker this evening. And then the final piece of civility news is please don't clap during tonight's panel. We'll maybe welcome our panelists with some applause, but during the panel itself, please refrain from clapping. So my final comment before I hand over the microphone is that, as you know, tonight's event is being held in conjunction with the investiture of our Chancellor, Dr. Mauli Agrawal. And so we're delighted to be able to participate in today's investiture events. And so with that, it's my privilege to welcome Dr. Agrawal to come and make a few welcoming remarks.
Good evening. It's good to have all of you here. I'd like to start by thanking American Public Square and Dr. Katz. They do such a great job every single time. It's really much appreciated. And also our esteemed panelists here. So this is a really timely topic. One of the greatest freedoms that we have in this nation is the freedom of speech. But that also means that we are allowed to have differences of opinion. And if we have differences of opinion, how do we converse with each other in a constructive fashion so that it's not divisive and we do not end up dividing each other or hating each other. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like a nation is doing a very good job of that at this point in time, and we need to do better. This morning, I was quoting Benjamin Disraeli, who said a university is a place of light, of liberty, and of learning. And our American universities are based on the philosophy of discourse. That's the foundation. So then how does a university help in this whole issue of civil discourse? So I'm looking forward to the discussion tonight. Thank you very much for coming.
And so with that, I'd like to introduce you to Allan Katz, who is the former U.S. Ambassador to Portugal, where he served from 2010 to 2013. He's also the founder of American Public Square. And so with that, I give you Allan and our panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Alana. Can you hear me in the back? Because I have a tendency sometimes to talk a little too softly, my wife tells me. And so, I want to make sure that I'm doing it. First of all, I'd like to introduce our panelists this evening. On my left, we have Dr. Kimberly Beatty, who is the Chancellor of Metropolitan Community Colleges. Seated to her left is Dr. Randall Hanna, Dean of Florida State University, Panama City campus. On Randy's left, we have Margaret Talev, who's the Senior White House Correspondent for Bloomberg News, who is making her third appearance on a panel of American Public Square. And to her left is also another three-time appearer, which is Dr. Michael McShane, who's the Director of National Research Education Choice and also a member of the American Public Square Advisory Board. So first of all, would you help me welcome our panelists tonight? So our topic tonight is the role and the responsibility of the university in fostering civil dialogue. And we have here two higher education administrators, one from a community college system and the other from a larger state university system, a journalist and an education policy expert. What I'd like to say, let's start with Dr. Beatty. I'd like to ask each of you from your different position and perspective, what do you believe is the role and the responsibility that higher education institutions have in fostering civil discourse? Dr. Beatty?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me, and congratulations to the Chancellor, and thank you for including me in this event. I think it was alluded to by the Chancellor or some of our comments earlier of our current state and government, and I think we have the same responsibility, and that is modeling the way, because it starts by how we model. And we have to first, in terms of whether it's a board of regents or in my case, it's a board of trustees, at the highest governance level of an institution, that we see that civil discourse at the top, because then it flows down to the employees and then flows down to our students. And so I think we first have a responsibility to model the civil discourse that we expect. And then I have an old saying, it's probably not that fantastic, it's very rudimentary in fact, that you have to inspect what you expect. Mm-hmm. And if you are expecting that we would have civil discourse, you have to you have to lead that, but you also have to inspect that and monitor when that doesn't happen, and use it as a teachable moment, so that we can continue to develop that. So those are some of the things that immediately come to mind.
Okay, Randy?
Thank you, Allan, for having all of us. Chancellor, congratulations. My hunch is you've had a number of hard days, but since you've been here, you probably have not had one bad day. And so congratulations to you. I tell every student who comes to Florida State University, Panama City, that I give them the FSU PC Promises. It's what I call it. I said, when you graduate, I'll shake your hand, and you'll not only have the skills from your degree, and hopefully be ready to go into graduate school, hopefully at Florida State, or to go into the workforce. But I also say that we're going to give you other stuff. If you do it right and you participate, when you leave, you'll have enhanced critical thinking skills. Hopefully you'll be a lifelong learner, and you'll understand the importance of being engaged in your community. And the importance of being engaged in your community is not only participating, but participating in a civil manner. So I believe it's part of our job, as part of higher education. Whether we have them in higher education for 6 months or a year for a certificate program, at a community college, whether we have them for 2 years, whether we have them for 4 years, or whether they're with us for 7 or 8 years with a doctoral program, that needs to be part of the basic education that all of those students receive.
So Margaret, when you jump in on this, I'd like you to also comment on whether or not Randy, having given you a paradigm, you, from a journalistic perspective, do you think that higher education is succeeding or not?
Thanks for that easy question, Allan. So I would say this. I think it may not surprise anyone here to learn that, especially over the last couple of years, I have spent a lot of time thinking about the relationship between civility and free speech and kind of the role of the press and other institutions in fostering discourse that actually goes somewhere, right? And I think there are some, it's not exactly parallel, but there are some parallels between the role of universities and the role of news organizations, mainstream news organizations, to both provide information and foster an environment where learning can take place and the exchange of ideas can take place. And when it's done well, it's an environment where differing viewpoints and viewpoints that are often in conflict can coexist, and people have a chance to challenge their own assumptions or try to make points to audiences that might not normally hear them. And when it kind of goes off the rails, it can just become a spectacle or a bunch of people yelling past each other. And I think so the goal, obviously, is option A rather than option B, but sometimes that's not possible. And I think that has to be okay within boundaries. But it becomes not okay when it becomes violent, when there's sort of hate involved, when it goes kind of past the guardrails of how society has to function. So like, who's supposed to be the judge of that, right? And the great thing about the First Amendment is the thing that makes it tricky too, which is that it's like mostly in the eye of the beholder. There are some cases where everyone agrees, you know, this is covered by the First Amendment, this isn't, but for the most part, you know, society judges it, and when society can't agree, it ends up in court. So to some extent, that's where we are now. I think for the most part, universities do a phenomenal job at fostering really interesting discussions on a variety of topics with all sorts of different points of view, but there have been some high-profile incidents in the last couple of years that have kind of become lightning rods for this debate, and I think the president has understood that there is a concern within his base that many universities are too liberal, the conservative viewpoint isn't heard enough. The only thing I would say, by way of kicking off this conversation, is that you can see how much society's changed when the free speech movement on campuses really got going in the mid-1960s, right? It was about the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War. It was about liberals at the time, and these are very mainstream views today, feeling that they needed to shake up the system, that the establishment wasn't listening to their point of view. Look at how the pendulum has swung now in terms of the people really pressing for this debate, the groups pressing for this debate. So, it is, yes.
Okay, thank you. Michael, when you weigh in now, I'd like you also to sort of address the issue that the president addressed in his recent executive order, which I read the order. I'm not quite sure I understand exactly what it says, but clearly the intent and the idea was that conservative voices are not being heard or possibly even repressed on campuses, and that should not be allowed. So A, do you think that's happening? And B, if you do, how do we fix it?
So I think that it, repress is a difficult word, right? You have to hit a pretty high standard to say that views are being repressed. I would say that we're standing on pretty firm ground when we say that most universities, or particularly the universities that a lot of, when we're talking in the media and other places, which incidentally are not necessarily always the universities that educate the bulk of the college students in America. And when we think of the typical, in the mind of, I think too frequently in the media, the typical college student is the 18 to 22-year-old who lives on campus and goes to a keg party on the weekend. And it turns out that that's actually not the typical college student in America. So sort of putting a fine point on that, perhaps setting it aside for a bit to say that we focus a lot. I mean, just think in recent weeks, we've talked so much about the admission scandals at these elite universities that in total educate somewhat fraction of a percent of college students across the country. And yet it's been on the news every single night. So, but with respect to, I don't know if I would go so far as to say repress. What I do think is that a lot of these universities have become more ideologically homogenous over time. And certain fields within universities have been, or the faculty members in those departments are overwhelmingly liberal. And I don't think that that's necessarily, I don't think there's a lot of debate about that. I don't know if I'm gonna get fact checked on that, but I don't think there's a lot of debate on that. And so what I worry in those cases is not so much that people are repressed or that these things, but the sort of more subtle or insidious problem where certain questions don't get asked or certain topics don't get discussed. And that's not, we don't necessarily see that manifest in the speaker getting shouted down or those are the things that are much more difficult to quantify and understand. But I definitely do think that happens on campus, that folks are, and I think it happens within classrooms where you have students that are from different perspectives that might be unwilling to share those because they're worried that they might be, in some of these cases, reported to campus authorities for having committed some sort of bias incident or something like that for sharing a belief that they have. But I think it also happens in the research space as well, that there are certain questions that people say, maybe you shouldn't, if you want to advance as a professor, maybe you shouldn't do research on that topic, or you don't know who might use your research and how might it be used. And so maybe you should look into something else. And I think that insofar as I really appreciate the Chancellor's channeling Benjamin Disraeli saying, it's light, liberty, and learning. And we think that those should be the guiding principles, not the sort of more day-to-day political machinations.
Okay, two things. First of all, if you have questions, write them down, hold them up. You don't have to wait. We'll start moving them as quickly as we can get them. And secondly, to our panelists, this is, I'm trying to turn this really, I would like this to become a conversation among the four of you. So I don't want anyone here to feel constrained to not sort of respond or sort of amplify on a point that someone else makes.
I was going to amplify on that last comment. I was listening intently, and I don't know, I think in the research space, I would definitely agree with you that there are sometimes people are constrained. I was just talking with a faculty member today who was trying to decide between going to Kansas State and getting her doctorate, or they have a certificate, I think, in social injustice, versus sociology versus curriculum and instruction, because she really wants to write curriculum, but she wants to do it from a social injustice lens. And interestingly enough, as I listened to you, I advised her saying, not that she shouldn't do that, but I thought she already had that social injustice lens, and that she could develop where her gap was over here. So I'm reflecting on how she may have received that. But the other the other side of what you were saying about faculty members, or I guess students in the learning environment, what I'm still seeing in the same conversation, what I'm still seeing is that we have faculty that, and I moved here from Houston, which was a little bit more diverse than Kansas City, and I think you still have the situation where, I know we have students where they might be the only Hispanic student in the class, and asked to speak on all the Hispanics in the country,
Right.
on a specific topic, and I just don't think that that's right. And the same goes for other cultures as well. So I think we still have a lot of work to do. And I mean, this was just today. I was having both of those conversations. And so I think there's still a lot of work to be done to, I think you can still have those conversations, but you have to learn how to foster them a little differently so that you don't, upset the apple cart too much.
So, Ambassador, you mentioned the president's executive order. Today in the Florida legislature, in a committee in the state Senate, they passed a bill. I don't know if it will pass the legislature, but it's moving in both houses to require, I think it's annual, it may not be annual, a survey by the statewide governing board of the 12 universities of intellectual freedom and diversity of viewpoint at the 12 individual universities in the state. The point that you made, there are a lot of people in this country who believe that our college and university campuses are not open to public discourse, whether they are or whether they are not. They believe it. And I saw that today with people I know and people I respect who voted for this piece of legislation because it was not a hotly debated topic. And how we're going to implement something like that, I have no earthly idea. The question to me is there's all the publicity about the speakers that are out delivering what I would call, in some instances, hate messages. And that's what makes the national news. That's what gets in the paper. That's where we have to spend a lot of our time as administrators preparing for the protest and the counter-protest. To me, the more important question, and I'm just going to pick one example, you can change it up, but since it's primarily conservative folks now who believe that their voices are not welcome, I think ask the question, is the kid who wears the Make America Great Again cap comfortable wearing it on campus? Is he comfortable telling people that he votes for Donald Trump? And is he comfortable having that discussion in a classroom? And so it's the point that you made about Hispanic students feeling uncomfortable, African American students feeling uncomfortable. But it's also a question of based upon diversity of thought, whether they're uncomfortable. And to me, that's probably a lot more important than how we deal with Richard Spencer or somebody else, one of these guys who are getting in the news.
Well, okay, so let's sort of move with that thought. One, there is the question of speakers on campus, and first of all, if a speaker is invited by a student group, I'd like to know from you all sitting on the panel here, do you think that alone should allow them space to speak on the campus? Whether it doesn't matter whether, in other words, almost regardless of what they have to say. The other part is what I want to get to in a minute is what was outlined in a letter by the Dean of the University of Chicago in terms of this whole concept of what are students entitled to in terms of, quote, a safe space where they don't have to listen to people that have different ideas than they have. But let's start first with Margaret, why don't I start with you? The question of, is there any speaker that should be denied access in the university environment if they've been invited by a student group?
Well, I feel like supremely unqualified to answer this because I'm not a university administrator, and I don't actually don't know what the laws necessarily say about this, and that's probably important. I mean, as a starting point, the presumption is that, of course, it matters who student groups want to have come speak on campus. And if someone is going to be denied a right to speak, I think the bar has got to be pretty high. But I kind of want to punt on this one because I do feel like this is something that, you guys actually deal with as a question. But from my perspective, like, I do actually think that the more important and the more common and the more frequent aspect of this is what happens in the classroom, what happens when the cameras are off and there is no media attention. I'll try to make up for punting on the question by addressing the media part of it if I can, which is that I think there are a couple of trends, and one of them is social media, which have made this a much more difficult question than it was 10 years ago. It used to be that if a controversial or polarizing speaker was going to come to campus on any part of the ideological spectrum, that it would be written about in the student newspaper, maybe in the local paper, maybe on the local news, maybe there'd be flyers around campus. But now it's going to be on Twitter. People will know about it. Thousands of people who have actually no relationship to the campus that are not even part of the community can then converge on there. Protests can be stood up. People can be mobilized for and against. It can be live streamed. It can be live streamed by the campus. If it's not live streamed by the campus and the presumption is that there is a live streaming, people will be upset for censorship because it wasn't live streamed. People can live stream it on their phones, inside the room and outside the room. And that completely changes the dynamic of speech, reach, audience, participation, security, like all of the above. So,
and decision making.
I'm sure that that's true. So I just think that has complicated things. And then that in and of itself turns into coverage. And the only thing I'll say about that is that since I work for a financial wire service that covers politics, like, it's not really my brand. I can't think of the last time when I went to a college campus to cover a protest about a controversial speaker. But I know that it happens, and I know that when it does happen, it's because people feel that it's a name who everybody knows about and will want to hear about it. And so these things that just become exponential in a way that they didn't used to.
Okay, so let's take where you've taken us now on this idea, the impact of social media and how it affects things. Let's go back to the underlying question that Randy raises, which is what's going on in the classroom, and then there's what's going on in the campus writ large. Do you think one affects the other? And the question, in other words, if we're not going to let whomever the speaker that was invited come because the decision's been made that that's an inappropriate person because of the way they speak, does that affect that the question that Randy raises in the classroom? And should the social media world we live in change the decision-making process by the university administrators about because the real issue is who do you bar? The question is not really who do you let come.
It's getting, pretty soon you'll bar no one. I did practice law for a while, not this area of law, but I'll try to answer the question. In most states, because there are individual state laws here, but under the First Amendment, if students invite a speaker, unless that speaker is inciting violence and harm to others, they have to be able to come. And if you rent your space out, now this is at a public institution under the First Amendment, if you rent your space out to the public, you have to treat everybody equally there. So I think those universities and colleges that are still working around the edges to try to bar speakers are probably making the issue worse in that regard. I think you have to be very careful with the protection of your students and the safety of your students. But generally the idea is that the public university is a meeting place. Now, if you do try to stop those groups, clearly it has an impact. But I think the bigger issue is just whether students are comfortable expressing an unpopular view, not only with their colleagues, not only with their classmates who may have a different view, but also concerned about what that professor thinks.
And I want to get you to react to this too. So you talked about if you think it's going to create violence. Of course, that sort of gets back into the question of, the old preventive detention notion in terms of you think someone's going to commit a crime. So we had the situation at Berkeley with Milo Yiannopoulos last year, where he came to the campus. Some people said he was going to preach hate speech or encourage hate speech, and it turned out they did have a riot, which caused a lot of problems. So the question is, does that mean that the people who create the problems get to affect who comes to the university?
But see, I would add, so Milo is an interesting case in all of this. I was just over the weekend preparing for this. I read that The Coddling of the American Mind, the Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt book. And it's interesting. They have a graph in there of number of speakers deplatformed or whatever, and they actually have a dot in there that's if you don't include that guy, the line is actually way lower. So he was clearly a provocateur. That's what he does. He's a provocateur. But the fascinating thing is, so this was the Berkeley thing. Was that last year?
No, it was 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
2017.
So where's that cat now? Oh, it turns out people just let him talk, and he said so many ridiculous things that now he lost. What, didn't Breitbart fire him?
He's off Twitter. He's off
Right?
most
He's
of the
off
media.
Twitter. He's off Facebook. From the last thing I saw, that he's auctioning off his personal goods because he's deeply bankrupted. So I understand that in the moment, these things can look like these anything, but a lot of these folks, and so he was able to fundraise off, I did all these things, whatever. But in some of these ways, these guys burn themselves out, and almost in ways, it's actually, you know what? Get up and let this person speak, because if any person actually listens to them, they're going to say, these folks are great. I don't want anything to do with that guy.
If you were going to apply the American Public Square rule to the way students inherently on their own decide to react to, if people just walked around with bells, then when somebody who most people found offensive came to campus, people would just be outside, they'd ding the bell and everyone would go home, right? But so the question is at what point do you preempt what you think might happen, even though what might happen is kind of stupid, because if you just reacted by not going, right. So you're completely right. You're exactly right. The strategic way to deal with a person who you find offensive is to ignore them and encourage other people to ignore them. But since when are college students strategic? For the most part, right?
So Dr. Beatty, I didn't mean to cut you off before. You had something you wanted to add on this.
Well, I was just going to say, I recently encountered this, and I think at public institutions, so we have to be careful when it comes to politics. I know in every institution, while there might be, and I don't mean to diminish, of course, First Amendment rights or anything like that, but I know at our institution, sometimes there's bylaws that kind of govern what we do, and we can't we don't want to ever have the perception of taking the stance in favor and supporting a candidate, a specific candidate. And so I know I'm always careful, and when students want to have political speakers, that we try to balance the card, and that we're not just having, one side of the conversation. I do think it's important to be careful in that regard.
Okay.
So Milo went to Berkeley. Milo came to Florida State. Did you read about it? No. You didn't read about it. There were protesters, but the administration had worked with the groups that they knew would be protesting and sat down with them way ahead of time and talked about it. And it was an educational experience. Now, clearly they protested, but it was in effect in effect a non-event. That requires hard work on the part of it wasn't me, but requires hard work on the part of the administration to be able to help manage that.
And in Berkeley's case, I mean, this is actually really interesting because Berkeley, of course, is where that free speech movement on campuses was born. And as a result of what happened in 2017, Berkeley has, from what I understand, understood that they have a special opportunity to kind of acknowledge the debate and figure out from a policy perspective what to do about it. And they have now created like a program, kind of an institute in Washington within their UC Washington shop that is specifically, the program is specifically geared toward understanding the future of the First Amendment, partially on campuses. And I think they might have just had an inaugural event today because I got an email that said, hey, sorry you missed the event. And I was like, well, sorry I missed the event too. I'm actually going to be talking about it in Kansas City. But I think like, not to be too meta here, but the great value of this program, which I think can and is and should be a model all over the country, is that the two other times that I've done these panels, we've had nonpartisan people, Democrats, Republicans, on the panel and in the room talking about different viewpoints on the same idea in a way where everybody who's here, like your buy-in for being here, is agreeing that you're going to listen to the other person, that you're going to like remain calm, allow them to speak, say your piece, and like maybe that gets everybody somewhere. And I think that's where a lot of Americans want to be. But there are news cycles and heat of the moment kind of events. There are polarizing events that make it really hard to do that. We have to teach each other how to do that.
Okay, we have, I think, some questions from the audience.
Yeah, we've had some successful roving and some good questions coming in. I like this
our
question.
rover, right.
Yeah, we're roving. I like this question from Ellen because it puts you in the shoes of a student. But she asks, what advice do you have for a student in a classroom that doesn't allow diverse opinions, particularly if the student is worried about retaliation from the teacher in grading?
What advice do you have for the student?
Yes.
Well, there's usually a support system in place at institutions outside of the classroom where we wrap around the student to get the support that they need or give them voice and support them in their voice. So I would say to reach out to some of those other sources. So that might be going to somewhere where that where that student feels safe, like their counselor or an academic advisor that they've had a relationship with, or a previous instructor. I can imagine that is seen and experienced where that intimidation does take place. But I think there are a lot of other avenues for students to find their voice or utilize their voice. And we don't always do the best job in letting them know where those resources are, but that would be my hope, that we would let that would be my advice.
I'm glad you answered that question. I agree totally with that. Students do struggle though with that. I mean, they struggle with just the basic issue of feeling that the level of instruction and interaction in a classroom is not adequate. And how do you say that to a professor without retribution on your grades? But the systems are there. We need to do a better job of making sure the students know about them.
I would say, I think we're primarily talking about undergraduate liberal arts education here, because if you're an undergraduate student and you're studying like coding or engineering or something, like, I sincerely hope that political ideology has 0% role in the classroom. And then my only question for the student is, what does it mean that you can't express yourself? Does it mean that you can't rationally express a point of view when it's appropriate in the context on an intellectual framework? Or does it mean that it makes you uncomfortable that many students in your class seem to be conservative or liberal and in a way that where you kind of preemptively feel that you should self-censor yourself? I think all those things matter. I'm not invalidating what the maybe imaginary, maybe real student might be feeling. I'm just saying, like, I think it's difficult to answer that question. So if you're studying political science or history, like these are, kind of sometimes qualitative studies. Like, I think it's harder to create a completely neutral setting for that. And I think, by the way, that this is a problem in big state universities. It's a problem on small private and public liberal arts campuses that lean left. And it's a problem in conservative colleges as well, where you might be going to a religious-based or a conservative-based institution, and that also may be kind of like a self-selecting in terms of who the speakers are and the leanings of the professors. And I think universities in some ways guide society, in some ways are reflections of society. And what we have now is a society where there's a lot of self-selecting kind of information behavior, whether it's the news channel that you watch, the neighborhood that you live in. Like, there are so many ways that technology allows us to wall ourselves off from people we don't think we agree with, and to find people that we think we're like. And I think you see some of that mirrored in the university systems.
There's been a lot of talk, I think it's sort of over the last 10 years, of this whole concept of being politically correct. And it means different things to different people at different times. And I think that the president seized upon that as a slogan in the campaign. And I think really what happened was that he energized a lot of people in terms of thinking there were certain things that, under the guise of being politically correct, were silly, and therefore that they were not going to sort of embrace them. But at the same time, I guess my question is that how does the university, how does the academy somehow come to grips with the fact that they want a diverse student body because they think it's better for the students that are there, and they believe that it is a more accurate reflection of the society within which these students are going to emerge, and at the same time not make people feel that we have comfort zones, and we have trigger warnings and all these kinds of things, which I think grew out of this notion that they wanted people to feel comfortable. So it seems to me it's a bit of a quandary. So, Michael, how do you think they ought to go about this?
I always think the poison is determined by the dose. So political correctness, insofar as it is not trying to say ignorant things to people, is a very good thing, right? Like, insofar as it's like manners, and insofar as it's, again, the example that was brought up earlier is not asking a person of a particular race or gender to then be that race or gender's representative for the semester. Like, if that's political correctness, like, I'm all for it, right? The problem is, I think there are beliefs that in some places, and again, it's important for us to think about exactly what institutions we're talking about here, and where that has gone too far. And that it has gone to a point of believing that this quote-unquote kind of safetyism, of saying that we want to insulate people from ideas that might be upsetting to them. So I think that that's the way we kind of navigate it, is that rather than thinking about it as this like either or, like either like political correctness is great or evil, or it's stupid or smart, we think of it much more as like a continuum of like, at what point are we crossing beyond where we're saying, look, we want people to feel welcome, and as higher education diversifies, more and more people from more and more backgrounds are going to come on campus, and we're going to have more and more of these conversations, and we're going to have to work with people, and we're going to have to do this crazy thing and educate them, and like educate people how to get along with one another and work with one another. And that's just going to become a part of the kind of evolving role of the institution. And then be on guard for, oh, wait, have we gone too far? Have we gone too far in the direction of saying, like, some of this exchange that students have with one another is actually a really great learning experience that we shouldn't try and push back. But I think thinking of it as a continuum rather than a dichotomy is the first step in that discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a case-by-case situation. I think I agree with you, if I'm understanding you correctly, that there's a value in the political correctness. I do think sometimes it goes too far, but I was just in a open meeting and somebody used the word tar baby in the meeting. And now that may not have relevance to a lot of folks, like, oh, what's wrong with saying tar baby? But
I kind of want to know what the whole sentence was, but I don't. Oh, God.
But regardless, it wasn't appropriate. So
Right, thanks.
the point, I guess the point I'm making is that there is still this need for political correctness. And I don't know, I was sitting here listening to you trying to think of where political correctness goes too far. I'm not sure that, I mean, we're definitely heightened and more sensitive as a society to it. And, you know, it's amazing all these years that it took us to this point to get there, but it's definitely still needed when you have situations like that.
Okay, Eric, next question from our audience.
Sure. This is a good branch from the discussion, but what is the role of faculty and how is the educational experience to be used in promoting civil discourse? And if I could have an addendum to this, I think this is really about like public relations. I mean, in 2019, people believe what they hear and they don't hear the whole story. I mean, there's been a few high profile cases. So how do you send the message of like what is happening on campus? What needs to be done? What's not happening right now?
Well, that's a huge question.
I added to the question. I apologize.
So what's happening right now? Ambassador, somebody talked about the letter from University of Chicago. I don't have any of those students in my campus. That's a completely different group of students.
Maybe they're just afraid to say how they feel.
No, I mean, the point that the students at the University of Chicago are a small segment of the overall population in this country, and they're probably paying $80,000 a year to go to school there. Some of my students are 26-year-old women who are working 2 jobs, and their husband just left them, and they're trying to continue their education to support their child. And their ability to have time to spend on a discussion about civil discourse is kind of like, I need my degree. I heard what you said, that I'm going to be a better member of my community. But it's a question of how much time they have in the day. And we're going to have to be more innovative in how we deal with that. One of the things that we're doing, while not directly on target, our Dean of our College of Social Work has a resiliency project, which I think is directly related to this, that helps students deal with stress. And, we just went through one of the nation's worst hurricanes at my campus. So resiliency is pretty important, but resiliency is dealing with the stress in your daily life. So I think it's faculty. We not only need to do what's in the classroom, but we need to be able to take the time out of the classroom. We need to have the support systems for those students. We need to make sure that we're doubling down on mental health counseling for those students. Some of the most effective people on a college or a university campus in helping our students, including helping them express their views, have nothing to do with the faculty. It may be the maintenance worker. It may be the custodian. A lot of times it's the police officer. So I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Can I just take off my journalism hat for a second and put on an academia hat. I had the really awesome luxury last semester of spending 3 months at Harvard at their Institute of Politics, which aims to educate students on a diversity of views about public participation with kind of civility as a framework of it, right? And so this is fun. I taught a class on Donald Trump. It was a non-credit weekly seminar, and the point of it was to talk to students about how the president communicates, how it's different than how past presidents have communicated, how it's forced institutions, all kinds of institutions, domestic, overseas, governmental, non-governmental business, journalism, whatever, to rethink how they communicate with an American president. And we would start every weekly session because since it was like a seminar, it was different students and members of the community every week. Some were regulars, some would just come when they could, or if they were interested in the speaker. So 2 observations. One, we would always begin the seminar by saying, this is a safe space. I use the term. You are allowed to disagree, but you don't get to run over somebody you disagree with. Everybody gets to say what they're thinking here. Nobody gets to shout or stare the other person down. This class does not, we don't have a point of view here. This is not like you're not on the right side or the wrong side. Everyone gets to say what they think. And that's how we always started it. The second is that my observations is a non-scientific sample from the students who would come every week, is that the discussion we're having it's not partisan. I think it's more ideological than it is partisan. There were more students who leaned left or who would self-describe themselves as Democrats or progressives than there were students who would describe themselves as Republicans or conservatives. But the Republicans tended to be more like kind of like a Paul Ryan Republican on that campus, and they were squeezed into a really weird spot because they weren't even sure, like, are they Republicans anymore? Where's the Republican Party? But they're not Democrat, or they're not Democrats, are they? And so it was like, these were students who were really struggling for how to define themselves in like the changing American political landscape, as well as what their place was on campus. Talk about like self-censorship. They just were not sure like how they would label themselves anymore. It was a weird, you could like almost see it happening in real time.
Okay, let me just
Like
throw in
singing
one-
my life song there.
I just want to sort of just share a quick story, because I teach at UMKC at least this semester, and the students there, frankly, it's a very diverse group from very different backgrounds, from very different parts of the two-state area, and we talked about the scandal, about the admissions scandal at Harvard. So I'm looking at the room and I realize there's no one in this room in all likelihood who was denied a spot at any of those schools because someone's father bought a building. And I asked them what they thought of it, and I had students who've never opened their mouth the entire semester weigh in on it. So these things do kind of, it doesn't really matter whether it's a public university, whether it's a more elite college or university. These things, I think, there's a certain commonality there in the sort of concept of right and wrong. And I think that's part of what I think at a university we need to try to get right. But the question I want to ask you all is this. So if in the community writ large there are examples of uncivil discourse or basically civil, basically really nasty talk back and forth, does the university have an affirmative responsibility to sort of call it out and to sort of point it out because that it's sort of so antithetical to what the university stands for?
English is my discipline, so I taught, argument and critical thinking and all those courses, and I think that to the point that was made earlier, this is where the liberal arts type of classroom, whether it's the English, history, or social sciences, really come into view. And I don't know if I would call it out because it's, in opposition to the values, but I do think that those topics, I couldn't even imagine being in a classroom today, teaching those same classes and starting, there's so much in the news to talk about. I think it's important. We have a responsibility to talk about those issues maybe for other reasons, like to inspire a diversity of ideas, to inspire, God, I just had a thought and it just escaped me. It's after 6 o'clock. But, well, first of all, to get, young people to be aware of what's happening in the world, because they just simply, it's a different generation. When I was 25, I didn't watch the news either. And so I think we have a responsibility to expose them to what's happening and have a civil discourse and conversation about that, and turn them into teachable moments where it's appropriate, where perhaps it is in opposition to the values. But often when I was teaching, those conversations would turn into real life conversations about what a student is experiencing today. And if there were, by chance, because the news was not as quite as lively as it is now, as when I was teaching, I would always use also Law and Order episodes because I love Law and Order, right? And there's always some type of small political aspect that you can pull out of Law and Order to use as discussion. So I don't know if it's a responsibility because it's in opposition to the values. I think you allow that to emerge out of the conversation, but it's, I think, our responsibility to inspire critical thinking, to keep this generation of college students with a balanced perspective of what's happening in the news, and to keep them aware and educate them through that medium. And I think it can be effective in that regard.
I would go a step further. And I've been thinking a lot about the role of the university as we look at our community, and it's devastated. I know I said that a few minutes ago, but the world, the country really doesn't realize the devastation that we have in the panhandle of Florida right now. It is horrific. And as I think about the role of the university in helping to rebuild the community, what is our role as far as helping with planning and zoning and redevelopment? What is our role with making sure social workers in the community have the extra training? It depends upon the individual situation. So in addition to what you just said, I think we have, depending upon the situation, I think we have an obligation to go into the community as appropriate to try to help solve those issues where there is that friction. You have to be very careful about it, but I do believe we do.
So I think that's very important. And obviously, I want to, those of you who actually have to do this, I will listen before and take everything that I say with a grain of salt, because I just sort of think about it. But one of the things, difference between thinkers and doers. But one thing that I do want to think about just for a second, sort of I took your question as something sort of beyond the pale happens in the community. There's perhaps some civic leader that is elected or an event happens. What obligation the university has to engage with that? And I think a very clear case can be made that obviously within the university, working with students, having discussions about it, providing if counseling services or things are necessary for the people that are part of the university community to cope with that, I think is important. I would probably, maybe not necessarily perhaps for philosophical reasons, but almost just for like tactical reasons of not necessarily going out, because if we tie this back to even what we were talking about earlier, the bill that just was in Florida or the executive order from the Trump administration, what I see a lot of this is a microcosm of broader political problems that we have in this country, and it's a culture of contempt. And Arthur Brooks, a former colleague of mine, who's headed to Harvard this summer, has a book that I think came out in the last couple weeks. It's a bestseller right now called Love Your Enemies. And he's a fantastic guy, and it's a fantastic book. And he diagnoses a lot of the problems in American politics as this culture of contempt, which I think, quotes Schopenhauer to say that contempt is the belief of the worthlessness of another person. You have contempt towards them. And oftentimes when I see this debate about colleges and the broader community, I see a lot of contempt, and unfortunately, it can be contempt that heads in both directions. So what you see is people in the outer community, particularly in states that perhaps have large numbers of people who themselves didn't go to college, there can be a lot of contempt. You see this in the news, right? That these are, socialist indoctrination places, and that they don't do anything, that they just suck tax dollars and all those things. Unfortunately, I think it is also true, and we have to be honest, that the contempt can also go from the inside out. And you can have, oftentimes, these might be small little blue islands in red states, and people that are on those campuses can have contempt for these anti-intellectual Gomers, hayseeds in the hinterlands who need to have more respect for all the smart stuff that we're doing here.
Potter's Southeast.
Yeah,
Right.
right? And so what I think Dr. Hanna said is actually really important. I see it almost as like a bigger version of the classic like town gown problems the universities have had for time immemorial, right? That universities sit within larger communities, and oftentimes if you go to Lawrence, Kansas or Columbia, Missouri, you have this sort of population, this huge 20,000 kids who come swinging in during the school year, and some work has to be done to say, hey, look, you are part of this broader community. Like, some of these people like KU. Some of these people don't like KU. Some of these people have views that are different from yours, but you have to respect that you're part of this broader community. So I think insofar as universities can reach out to the community to do the very things that you talked about, which is leverage their expertise when it comes to important questions of the day and providing resources to local K-12 schools, for example, or others. I think that's a great way to kind of bridge that town-gown divide that's now social media and all these things have flattened. But I would be careful when they're sort of weighing in, quote unquote, from the ivory tower on the politics of the day. Just not if they're right or not if they're wrong, but because it could exacerbate this type of tension that already exists out there.
Just quickly, can I amend my answer? If asked, if invited, and if we have that relationship, that appropriate relationship, we should be asked and we should be invited to participate at some level. Even with the issues which were not politically controversial in our community, we made sure that the community wanted it. So once a community wants it and there's an opportunity, we need to be ready to move as opposed to just staying insular within the corners of our institution.
Not at all. Before we do the next, I just wanted to put back on my journalism hat for a second and ask you guys a question, which is, how many people here went to college? And how many people here went to like a big state university? And how many went to like a small campus? Okay, well, that's so really evenly split. And how many people participated in a student protest ever? How many people didn't? Wow, okay, that's all.
That was a good little poll there.
Yeah, that's right.
And quick, too.
Yeah.
Okay, Eric, you have another question from the audience.
I do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Paul asks, and he basically is saying, like, if is uncivil discourse, very popular uncivil discourse, is that just part of the education process so you can see how civil discourse does work? I mean, is this just a natural thing that's going to happen and you get to see both sides of it?
Can I go first?
Yeah.
Sometimes I think uncivil discourse is necessary. I'm going to put an asterisk next to that. But I think there are times in our society where we don't agree on an issue, when the issue inherently, in and of itself, is tearing people apart. But I think there's a difference between, I don't know, I guess this is a rhetorical question. How do you define uncivil? I'm not advocating violence.
Eyes of the beholder, right?
Yeah, I'm not advocating violence, but sometimes you got to raise your voice a little. Sometimes you have to show numbers. I'm talking about volume numbers, like in terms of turnout. Sometimes smiling and nodding and saying, and how do you feel about it, isn't going to get it done. Sometimes you need to be chanting and, whatever it is. But I think that there's a difference between that and going to a default of yelling and a default of antagonism. And there's a time and a place for kind of the uncivil version of civility, right? I mean, civil disobedience is different than throwing Molotov cocktails and throwing punches. So I think there's a space between where we are tonight and the kind of stuff that's inappropriate or not covered by the First Amendment. And I think, the way you preserve the power of those moments of civil disobedience is not to go from like 0 to 10 on everything, to save it for the stuff that really matters. Whoever defines that.
Yeah, just to put one last point, as someone who's obviously on the board of American Public Square, so obviously I'm big team civility, it is incumbent upon us who believe in civility to not use it as a cudgel to silence people
Yes.
when they are inconvenient.
Well,
I think that's,
yeah.
right? Because sometimes it's like, well, I don't like what that person's saying, and maybe they're passionate about it. It's because it matters,
Yeah.
and so they're passionate about it. And so for us to say, like, oh, sorry, you're being a little bit too uncivil, when it's really like, actually, that's an argument I don't have an answer for. We have to be careful there.
Yes.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I would agree that part of the college experience is learning, experiencing all sides of that. As much as we would like all conversations and activities on campus to be civil, it's part of the journey to experience all of that. So I would agree that it is a part of the experience.
Eric, you got another question for us?
Yes, I do have another question for the two academic professionals directed to them. Sorry, guys.
It's okay with me.
The doers.
Exactly.
So, just a question, like, and I'm guessing I know the answer to this, but have you ever banned or said no to a speaker at any of your institutions? And I guess we can expand on that a little bit. What's like a situation that you've dealt with closest to this that you can relay to us? Anything that's come up where you've had to maybe step in and make a difference?
So, we actually do have a policy about political events, and as a public institution, us appearing to take the position of a political figure. So I did have to put a stop to a speaker that was coming that would have that would have made it appear as if we were supporting this one candidate. But what I did was say, we love to have, I think this is an awesome opportunity for our students to engage in a political conversation. We just need to make that invitation available to all of the candidates. And they decided not to do that because their intention was different.
Yeah.
Randy, have you had anything to?
Yeah, it's really not anything newsworthy, but it was a very interesting example of working with your students. When I first got to Florida State University, Panama City, I wanted to start a more robust Black History Month program. We are lacking as far as diversity where it should be on our campus, and part of that was to invite middle school and high school students from the school district to come to our campus for a day and listen to a speaker. And so we did it the first year. It was a great success. The school district had a bunch of buses, and students spent all day there. The second day, the students decided who they wanted. The second year, the students decided who they wanted as their speaker. And I was walking down the hall one day, and the school superintendent, I could tell it was him on the phone, he said, "Have you looked at the speaker that you're going to have?" And he was a well-known speaker, but most of his talks are on the lack of success of public education. And these were all public education kids that were coming to this event. I'd have 400 kids with my student government having selected a person to tell them they were not receiving a good education. So it was a great experience to sit down and talk to the Student Government Council and say, here are the facts. We're going to let you decide where you want to go. And we agreed that if he did not come for this event and they had another event, that we would support that. So that's about the closest that I've come.
I would have covered the heck out of that story if I could.
I'd have never told you.
Yeah, I know. That's
Careful
right.
to leave out some salient details
Do
there.
some
yeah.
sourcing, yeah.
I'd have never told you.
Probably a good move.
Eric, you have another question?
I guess the best way to phrase this is like we were talking about then and now, and just like the amount of politics involved in the situation. I mean, really nothing's changed over time. I mean, it's as bad now as it was then. I mean, it's always politics, right, Margaret?
Everything's always politics, Eric. Thank you, yes.
That's it.
That's the question?
Yeah.
Wait, what's the question? Sorry.
About how it's so politicized right now. You talked about it a little bit earlier.
I mean, there's been other times in America where things were highly politicized, like a lot of other times. I mean, basically, I think every presidential cycle has its moments of division and politicization, and then there's been like major movements in American history. We can skip the Civil War and start later, but how about from the 1960s on, civil rights, Vietnam War protests, Bush-era war protests, Obama-era war protests, so the 2000 election, right? So I think the difference, there's two bits of difference, and one is that we were talking about social media before. News is so instant, and communications outside of the filters of news organizations is so instant and so pervasive that everybody, like, things just get into the bloodstream much faster. And part of the culture of 140 characters, 200, however many there are now, is that we seem to be a more kind of conflict oriented society in terms of the way we discuss stuff now. And so it amplifies things that are already polarized. But I think, you know, I mean, as we were just talking about, the whole movement of speech on campus. This is how many years now? 40, 60, like a 60-year life cycle that we're talking about.
I've got a hot question here.
Oh.
As an extension of the politics, but so how does a university address ideologies that are not based, I love this question, that are not based in fact in the light of free speech?
They want to tackle that? How about the ideology? Are there ideologies based in fact? Oh, well, that's another question.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
I would call for some epistemological humility. And
say that 3 times.
What I mean by that is, I think lots of people think that other people's ideas are not based in fact, right? It's a tendency that all of us have. We're the reasonable ones. They're the ridiculous ones.
You're not saying there's no such thing as facts, though, are you?
Not at all. In fact, the point that I would make is that oftentimes our most fervent debates are actually when the facts are relatively agreed upon, but our views of them are so divergent that we look at the same event. It's when we're debating about the facts of it, that's not when stuff gets real nasty. It gets real nasty when it's like, oh, actually, we've agreed upon these facts, but I look at these numbers and I see green and you see yellow and you see pink, and that's when people can't have these things with one another. So I would say that before people quickly dismiss and say, these other people are not based in facts, to interrogate that a little bit more and maybe say, do they interpret the facts differently? Do they not? And look, maybe you will come across people that are completely not based in fact, and that exists across the world. But I think that should be a position of last resort.
Okay, let me just say a couple of things, because we're about to get to a final portion that we do in these programs. But to pick up on your point, you all, and in the very beginning, you were told there is a fact sheet that's in your program. We prepare a fact sheet before every program. It is run by the panelists to make sure there's no disagreement about the facts, so that we don't wind up spending time arguing about whether or not this is a pen, okay? We can argue whether it's a pretty pen or an ugly pen or whatever. So, and frankly, that the basic concept of this American Public Square has always been everyone who disagrees thinks the facts are on their side. No one says, well, I know the facts are on the other person's side, but I'm not for it. But I still believe what I believe. So, but what we do at this point of our conversations is we have, as we're wrapping this up, we ask each panelist to sort of comment on two things. And we want to ask them with the two questions. One question is, so what? We've talked about this, but I mean, like, so what do you draw from all of this? And then the other question is, now what? Which basically gives each panelist an opportunity to sort of give what they believe that the next step forward should be on the topic that we're discussing. So let me start with you, Dr. Beatty. So what and now what?
Well, so what? I think we have learned a lot, and now what? I think we have a lot to learn.
Fair enough. Randy.
So what? It's pretty cool to be living today when so many more people have the ability to express their views than did 60 years ago or 70 years ago. So it's pretty cool that many more people are able to express their views, and there are more mediums in which to do that. But we have to understand how to work through that process. And the next step for me, the next step I believe, is to stay away from the big stories that seem to make the news, but worry about what's happening not only on the college campus in that classroom, but outside of that classroom as we're working with students, and actually before they get there, much before they get there, to understand the importance of that civil discussion, but making sure that people understand that everyone's voice should be heard there. So stay away from the bigger news stories, sorry. But think about, and I know I said this was not a political statement, but think about how do we make sure that student with the Make America Great Again cap is comfortable in that classroom.
I think I'm going to roll the so what and the now what into one answer because I feel really strongly about this. All of this is important. Civility is really important. It holds the fabric of society together. There is a bigger coming challenge than any of this, and it is the challenge to preserve the First Amendment and what it means to all of us. And I just think that as we navigate the kind of modern societal expectations, especially in places of higher learning, of respecting one another's viewpoints and listening to each other, that the right to sometimes offend people or challenge people in a way that makes them uncomfortable is incredibly precious and very rare. And between technological advancements and artificial intelligence and hacking and disinformation campaigns and rising authoritarian regimes that are going to compete with the US economically, that there's going to be a real squeeze put on the First Amendment, and that even as we all try to take care of each other's feelings, it's really important to understand that the First Amendment is one of the things that has always made America great, and is a reason why America is great now, and is something that is very easy to lose, that we're all very vulnerable to. And most You know, most of us have not lived through war, have not served in a war. Most of our kids have no idea what that is. Most of our society today takes for granted that we can always get information when we want it, that we can get a diversity of information, that we can take any point of view we want, that we can express any point of view we want, because that's just enshrined in the Constitution. But we all have a role in holding on to that. And I just think even as we debate, like, you know, how loud can you be and how much can you dissent, like, we have to fiercely protect the First Amendment, whether that's critical news coverage that you don't like of the candidate that you support, whether it's being in college and having to listen to some guy who lives in the dorm next to you who's got some poster that you disagree with or whatever. Like, preserving the First Amendment, even when it makes you very uncomfortable, is incredibly important. Thank you. That's it.
Here. That's a tough act to follow. Sort of building off of that, my sort of so what and now what would be similar. I think it's important for us to be honest about the fact that some people, particularly, and we see this manifested in a lot of these kind of campus provocateurs, have figured out how to monetize outrage. So somebody goes on campus and then they have someone with a cell phone watch them, and then when someone shouts them down, it can go up on YouTube or it can get sent to donors, and this thing can rev this up. And so my kind of now what is, it is incumbent upon all of us, if we don't want to see that, that works because we click on it, because we share it on Facebook, because we tweet about it. But if we chose to ignore that, and every time when YouTube or Twitter suggests that you like insert person you like, and then in all capital letters, destroys college student of political position that you don't like, if we didn't click on those people would stop making money off of them. But as long as we keep saying, and we share them to somebody else, like, look at Ben Shapiro, show that socialist college kid about the beauties of the free market, that just keeps revving this system up. And so I think it's important that all of us take the responsibility that comes with the First Amendment and say that it's incumbent upon us to use it in the ways that can actually better our communities and not abuse it, and then allow all these people to have all these justifications for why they want to get rid of it, which we don't want to see happen.
Okay, thank you. I want to just sort of, before we thank our panelists and give out a few civility bells, there's a story that most of you don't know. 50 years ago, back in February, on this very, well, we're not on campus, at UMKC, there was a program that was put together called, under the rubric of the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Symposium. It was on dissent. And a group of speakers had been signed up, and the members of the Board of Curators attempted to block it taking place. Now, the reason I remember that was I was the one that organized the symposium. And fortunately, reason prevailed. No riots occurred on the campus. Everyone from Ben Spock to a closing night concert with Pete Seeger all proceeded, and everyone enjoyed it. Well, maybe not everyone, but most of us enjoyed it. And I think what it did, it was an example of what things were like 50 years ago. In other words, it was not an automatic, well, of course, these students or these people can come up here on campus. So I think that, you know, when you talk about, Margaret, about how the fact that we've had contentious times before, as somebody who grew up in the 60s, let me assure you, there were many contentious times before. But I'd like to thank our panel. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
You know, I want to also thank our roving reporter, Eric. Where are you? Okay, thank you. We do have two first-time panelists, and we present them, and we're also going to present to Eric what we call one of our civility bells, and the hope is they will put it in either their office or their home, whichever is appropriate.
Come in handy.
And so it would come in handy so that you can bring it, you know. We want to thank tonight's sponsor, UMKC, and all of our presenting sponsors. I want to thank all of our volunteers, those that you saw in the black T-shirts that helped gave you programs. Thank you all very much for all that you do every time we have a program. You're going to be receiving in your inbox a link to a short post-event survey. Please take a minute to complete it. We get them from every one of our programs, and we find them very valuable in terms of determining what we do right and what we don't do right. I'd like you to, there are 2 American Public Square events coming up in April I'd like to invite you to. One is in just 2 nights. The American Public Square Student Initiative will present Suspended Race and Discipline at School at Truman High School. It'll be Thursday starting at 6 p.m. 6 p.m. And on April 30th, we have our annual Evening at the Square, which is the one fundraiser that we do every year. We'll be featuring Andrew Gillum, who will be speaking on how we return civility to our politics. Again, let me urge you to become a member of American Public Square tonight if you're not already. And if you were to purchase tonight a membership at the $250 level, you would receive a free ticket to our fundraiser on April the 30th. The details are in the playbill and at AmericanPublicSquare.org. Let me offer my congratulations to the Chancellor on this 2-day celebration of his becoming Chancellor. And I want to thank you all very much for being here tonight. Please have a pleasant evening.